There is a specific transition that happens in the financial life of anyone who has successfully moved through the previous stages of this journey, breaking the monthly cycle, reaching a first meaningful savings milestone, and making a deliberate decision about deploying that first capital wisely. The transition is this. The challenge stops being purely about accumulation and starts becoming about architecture. In the earlier stages, the primary question was simple in structure, even when difficult in execution. How do I save anything at all? How do I reach a specific target? How do I make one good decision about deploying that target once reached? But once capital begins genuinely growing, once the deployment, decisions from the previous stage start generating returns, once a second income stream starts compounding, once disciplined, saving continues month after month on top of an already existing base, a new and more complex challenge emerges that most people are never explicitly taught to address. The challenge of growing capital is not the same as the challenge of accumulating it. Growing capital requires structure. It requires separation between money serving different purposes, because money that all sits in one place, serving every purpose simultaneously, inevitably gets misallocated, spent on the wrong thing at the wrong time, exposed to the wrong risks, or left vulnerable to exactly the kind of single bad decision that can erase months or years of careful accumulation in one moment. Dangote's empire, at every stage of its growth, has operated according to a specific architectural principle regarding how capital is separated, protected, and deployed according to its specific purpose. Today I'm going to walk through the 5-account system that embodies this principle. Adapted specifically for where you are right now in your own financial journey, whether your accumulated capital is measured in hundreds of dollars or has grown well beyond that initial milestone. Why one account is the enemy of growing wealth. Before walking through the specific 5 accounts, I want to explain precisely why a single, undifferentiated account becomes increasingly dangerous as capital grows. Even though it may have functioned adequately during the earlier accumulation phase, when all your money exists in one place, every financial decision competes against every other financial decision for the same pool of resources, with no structural distinction between fundamentally different purposes. The money meant for long-term investment sits in the exact same place as the money meant for tomorrow's groceries, which sits in the exact same place as the money meant to protect against a genuine emergency. This absence of separation creates a specific and predictable failure pattern. When an unexpected expense arises, and unexpected expenses arise regularly in any life, the path of least resistance is drawing from whatever undifferentiated pool of money exists, regardless of what that money was originally intended for. Over time, this pattern systematically erodes whatever portion of accumulated capital was meant for longer-term purposes, simply because there was no structural barrier preventing it from being redirected toward whatever immediate need happened to arise. The 5-account system solves this problem directly by creating physical and psychological separation between capital serving fundamentally different purposes, such that drawing from the wrong account for the wrong purpose requires a deliberate, conscious decision rather than simply happening by default because everything exists in the same undifferentiated place. Account 1, the primary income account. This is the account where all income arrives initially, regardless of source, salary, business revenue, trading income, any second income stream you have developed. The specific function of this account is not accumulation. It is distribution. Money should not remain in this account for any extended period. Instead, this account functions as the entry point through which income arrives, before being deliberately allocated across the remaining 4 accounts according to a predetermined structure decided in advance, exactly as discussed in the pre-allocation principle from earlier content on this channel. The specific discipline required here is resisting the temptation to let money simply accumulate in this primary account because allocation feels like an additional, optional step rather than a mandatory immediate one. The moment income arrives in this account, the predetermined allocation process should begin, moving appropriate portions toward each of the remaining 4 accounts according to percentages decided in advance. Account 2 to the emergency fund account. This account serves a single specific purpose, providing a buffer against genuine financial disruption, a medical emergency, an unexpected period without income, a critical repair or replacement that cannot reasonably be delayed. The specific target for this account, as a general guideline, is 3 to 6 months of essential living expenses. Though the exact target should be calibrated to your specific circumstances, including the stability of your income sources and your specific family and community obligations, this account requires a particular psychological positioning that distinguishes it from the other accounts in this system. It should be accessible enough that genuine emergencies can be addressed without excessive delay, while being separated enough through being held at a different institution or through requiring an additional deliberate step to access, that it does not become the default source of funds for non-emergency spending simply because it happens to be available. The specific discipline this account requires is maintaining strict honesty about what genuinely constitutes an emergency, as distinct from a want, a desire, or even a reasonably significant but non-critical need. This account exists specifically to prevent exactly the kind of crisis-driven, desperate financial decision-making discussed in earlier content on this channel, the decisions people make when they have no buffer and a genuine emergency forces them into high-cost borrowing or the abandonment of other financial progress. Account 3, the high-yield holding account. This account serves as an intermediate destination for capital that has moved beyond the emergency fund's purpose, but has not yet been deployed into longer-term investment vehicles, either because the specific investment decision has not yet been finalized, or because the capital is being accumulated toward a specific investment threshold. Across various African markets, fintech platforms and formal financial institutions increasingly offer holding accounts with meaningfully higher returns than basic savings accounts, though the specific available rates and platforms vary considerably by country. And this is an area where researching the specific reputable options available in your particular market is genuinely valuable, given how rapidly this specific landscape continues to evolve. The specific function this account serves, beyond generating some return while capital is held, is providing a deliberate pause between the decision to set capital aside for longer-term purposes and the final deployment of that capital into specific investment vehicles. This pause allows for more deliberate, less impulsive investment decisions rather than feeling pressure to deploy capital immediately into whatever investment opportunity happens to be most visible or most recently suggested at the exact moment the capital becomes available. Account 4, the investment account. This is the account where genuine long-term wealth building occurs, and it represents the account most directly aligned with the framework discussed in the previous video regarding evaluating specific deployment decisions. The specific instruments appropriate for this account vary by your specific market, your specific risk tolerance, and the specific scale of capital involved, but generally include formal investment vehicles such as government treasury instruments, regulated mutual funds, equity investments in publicly traded companies, or direct investment in business activities you understand well, consistent with the third question from the deployment framework discussed previously. Matching investment to your actual demonstrated capability rather than purely aspirational ambition. This account requires a specific psychological discipline that differs from the other accounts in this system, where the emergency fund and primary income account are oriented toward stability and accessibility. This account should be oriented toward patient, long-term growth, with an explicit understanding that short-term volatility in value is normal and expected, rather than a signal to withdraw capital prematurely in response to temporary fluctuations. The specific principle Dangote's own trajectory illustrates regarding this category of capital involves a distinction between growth phase and protection phase that becomes increasingly relevant as the capital held in this account grows substantially over time. In earlier stages, when the absolute amounts involved are more modest, more aggressive growth-oriented deployment is generally appropriate, since potential losses, while undesirable, do not threaten catastrophic consequence given the modest absolute amounts involved. As capital in this account grows substantially over years, a portion increasingly shifts toward more protective positioning. Assets, specifically chosen for their stability and their resistance to the kind of currency devaluation and inflation risk that has historically affected various African economies at different points, rather than purely growth-oriented positioning that might be entirely appropriate for more modest amounts but carries different risk implications once the absolute capital at stake has grown substantially. Account 5, the spending account. This final account serves a purpose that is frequently underweighted in discussions of disciplined financial behavior, but which serves a genuinely important function within this overall system. This account exists specifically for discretionary daily spending, lifestyle expenses, and the kind of enjoyment-oriented spending discussed earlier. Regarding the legitimate psychological need for some acknowledgement and enjoyment, separate from the core, capital being protected and grown through the other 4 accounts. The specific principle here is that this account should receive a clearly defined, predetermined allocation, not whatever happens to remain after all other obligations are met, which tends towards zero as discussed in earlier content regarding the cycle of having nothing left by month's end but a specific, deliberate amount decided in advance as part of the overall allocation across all 5 accounts. This deliberate allocation toward discretionary spending serves an important function within the overall system's sustainability. A system that allows zero discretionary spending whatsoever tends to produce exactly the kind of resistance and eventual abandonment discussed in earlier content regarding the psychological challenges of sustained financial discipline. A specific, bounded allocation toward this account allows genuine enjoyment and discretionary spending to coexist with disciplined growth of the other 4 accounts, rather than treating these as fundamentally incompatible objectives. If you are still watching, subscribe right now, because what comes next addresses exactly how these 5 accounts should be calibrated against each other as capital grows over time, including the specific shift between aggressive growth positioning and protective positioning that becomes increasingly important as the stakes involved increase. Calibrating the system as capital grows. The specific percentage allocation across these 5 accounts should not remain static throughout your entire financial journey. Instead, the appropriate calibration shifts as your overall financial position evolves, reflecting the changing balance between accumulation, growth, and protection appropriate to different stages. In the earlier stages of this journey, corresponding to the period before reaching that first meaningful milestone discussed in previous content, the emergency fund and the investment account typically receive priority allocation, even at the expense of a more generous spending account allocation, since the foundational protection and growth that these accounts provide matters disproportionately during this initial period. As capital accumulates further and the emergency fund reaches its target threshold, the relative allocation shifts. With the emergency fund fully established, a larger proportion of ongoing income allocation can shift toward the investment account. Specifically, since the protective function the emergency fund provides has already been adequately established, as the investment account itself grows substantially over years as moving well beyond the kind of amounts discussed in the previous video. Regarding initial deployment decisions, the internal composition of that investment account itself should shift following the growth phase to protection phase principle mentioned earlier. A meaningful portion of substantially grown capital should transition toward assets specifically chosen for their stability against currency devaluation and inflation risk, even as a portion continues pursuing growth-oriented opportunities. This is precisely the pattern Dangote's own enterprise demonstrates at industrial scale, maintaining diversification across multiple sectors specifically to reduce the risk that any single sector's disruption threatens the entire enterprise, while simultaneously maintaining meaningful holdings and operations structured to provide resilience against the kind of currency and economic instability that has historically affected various African markets at different points. The specific diversification across cement, sugar, salt, flour, and eventually petroleum refining was not simply about pursuing growth in each individual sector. It was about building structural resilience through diversification, such that no single sector's disruption could threaten the survival of the entire enterprise. The same principle, applied at whatever scale is relevant to your own specific financial position, suggests that as your investment account grows substantially, increasing diversification across different asset types, and increasing allocation toward assets specifically resistant to currency and inflation risk becomes increasingly important, not because growth-oriented investment becomes less valuable, but because the absolute stakes involved in potential losses increase as the underlying capital grows. The specific behaviors that protect this system. Beyond the structural account separation itself, several specific behaviors determine whether this system actually functions as intended over an extended period, rather than gradually eroding back toward the kind of undifferentiated, single account approach that created the original problem this system is designed to solve. The first behavior is maintaining strict boundaries regarding which account serves which purpose, resisting the temptation to draw from the investment account or emergency fund for purposes that more appropriately belong to the spending account, simply because a specific desired purchase exceeds what the spending account currently contains. The second behavior is conducting a regular, scheduled review of the overall system, not constantly monitoring each account, which tends to produce exactly the kind of anxious, reactive decision-making that undermines patient long-term positioning, but a deliberate, scheduled review, perhaps monthly or quarterly, to confirm that allocations remain appropriate to your current circumstances and that no ways account has drifted significantly from its intended function. The third behavior, particularly relevant given how rapidly fintech platforms and available financial instruments continue evolving across African markets specifically, is periodically researching whether better options exist for each specific account's function, since the platform offering the best returns for a high-yield holding account today may not remain the best option indefinitely. Given how quickly this specific landscape continues to change, what this system actually protects you from. I want to close by returning to the specific connection between this 5-account architecture and Dangote's own demonstrated principles throughout his career, because understanding why this structure matters reinforces the discipline required to maintain it consistently. This system protects against several specific failure modes that have affected countless individuals and even substantial enterprises across this continent and beyond. It protects against the complete erosion of long-term capital by short-term, immediate needs by creating structural separation that requires deliberate decision rather than passive default. It protects against catastrophic vulnerability to a single unexpected emergency by maintaining a specifically designated buffer for exactly that purpose. It protects against the slow erosion of value through inflation and currency instability by incorporating protective positioning specifically calibrated to the economic realities of the markets where this capital exists, and it protects against the kind of complete devastation that affects individuals and enterprises that concentrate everything into a single, undifferentiated pool, vulnerable to a single bad decision, a single emergency, or a single market disruption, eliminating an entire financial foundation built through years of disciplined effort. Dangote's industrial empire, having weathered multiple economic crises, currency devaluations, and market disruptions across more than 4 decades, demonstrates at an enormous scale precisely the principle this 5-account system applies at whatever scale is relevant to your own current circumstances. Structural separation, deliberate allocation according to specific purpose, and calibrated adjustment as the overall position grows. These principles apply identically whether the capital involved is your first $1,000 or an industrial empire spanning multiple countries and sectors. Start building this structure now, regardless of how modest your current capital may be. The specific accounts may hold modest amounts initially, but the structural discipline of maintaining genuine separation between capital, serving fundamentally different purposes, is precisely the discipline that determines whether your own financial trajectory over the years and decades ahead follows the pattern of compounding growth this entire series has been building toward, or eventually succumbs to exactly the kind of single bad decision or unexpected disruption that this structural separation is specifically designed to prevent. If this system gives you something concrete to build starting this week, subscribe. New videos every 2 days on the mindset and systems behind Africa's greatest business empire. See you in the next one.